Today is Thursday, February 13th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. On Wednesday evenings, we have a voluntary open Zoom meeting for parents in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, which is just an open Q&A session where we take up questions and discuss different topics, and the conversation starts at 9 o'clock at night, Eastern Time, and continues as long as the discussion continues. Last night, I think we were on until past midnight. But during the conversation last night, one question was asked about how to go about making difficult decisions, whether there's some kind of method or approach to decision-making that's helpful when we just really have a difficult decision and we can't see any clear answer to a question or a problem or some decision that needs to be made. And I said that I do actually have something of a method that I use that I wouldn't say that I developed it. It's more like it was revealed to me just through my own experiences. It emerged as a way of dealing with difficult decisions where I don't really have a clear answer, and yet I've got to make a decision, and the decision is significant. It's a decision that has great consequences. Those are the worst kinds of decisions. And so I said in the meeting last night that I would take some time in a separate talk to share this method and to also just share some general principles for us to consider when we've got really difficult decisions to make. And I'd like to do that in this talk. Now, you can imagine someone in my situation, in my circumstances in life. I've been faced with lots of difficult decisions. I'm the first Christian in my family for several generations. I'm the first to go to college. I'm self-employed. I do work that's relatively unique. The work that I do in classical Catholic education, the research that I've done, the work that I've had to do developing and making classical Catholic education available, being a father of 10 children, having to bear the challenges of independently funded research work in education with providing for a large family. The mixture of circumstances in my life has left me with many decisions at different times for which I couldn't turn around and ask for counsel from someone who had done what I was seeking to do or who had experience with an issue that I was struggling with. I haven't been able to turn to anyone for practical experience with decisions I needed to make. And so I've had to sort through some complex questions on my own. And as I've done that through the years, a method of making decisions has emerged. Now this began back around 2005 or 6, 2005, I guess, when my third child, my second son, was 6 months old. He was diagnosed with a heart condition. I think the term for it was atrial septal defect, a heart condition where there was a hole detected in his heart. And so we were advised by our physician after the testing was completed to go and have a consultation with a surgeon here in Charlotte to discuss what our options were, to talk about surgery, the risks of surgery, and to try to get as much information as we could to make a decision. So there I was in the midst of a busy life as a young father, not much money, working as a private school teacher, with this dilemma that I needed to make a decision on. I needed to decide whether my 6-month-old son, who was visibly healthy, the problem was detected by a doctor noting that his heart seemed to have a strange rhythm to it. There was no visible sign of any lack of health, any problem in my son. It was just a routine well visit to the doctor. But I had to make this decision. And so as we talked with the surgeon, as we went through the options, the surgeon, thanks be to God, was very honest with us. And I made it clear that I wanted him to be honest with us, that I wanted to make a decision based on good information. And I believe he was honest with us because he told us that the surgery that would be needed to help my son was a very difficult surgery because the hole was actually located in the back of his heart. And it was very dangerous. It was a high-risk surgery. And that was very helpful because that factored into the decision. And so as I went home and wrestled with this decision that needed to be made, I tried morally to think about it, what my moral obligation was. I tried to think, there was no financial consideration because of health insurance, but I tried to figure out morally what to do, and I realized the answer really wasn't in a moral issue. And so as I continued just to wrestle with it and chew through the options, what I started to see was I really had a very simple decision to make. I was going to decide to approve of the surgery, to give permission for the surgery, or to not have the surgery. It was a very simple decision. It was a yes or a no decision. Very simple decision to make, a yes or a no decision. But there were two different possible outcomes for either decision. If I chose to have the surgery, there were two possible outcomes. If I chose to not have the surgery, there were two possible outcomes. So there were a total of 4 different scenarios that were possible. And again, I was just sort of drawing this out for myself, thinking through it, writing out different ideas. But I came to see that there were 4 different possible scenarios. There was the choice to act or the choice to not act. And then there was a desirable outcome and an undesirable outcome, which, when joined together, produced 4 different scenarios. And I drew a square and divided it into 4 parts, with the 2 options listed on the left-hand side of that diagram and the 2 possible outcomes listed at the top of that diagram. And so I said, okay, well, option 1 is to choose to go ahead and give permission for this surgery. So choose to act. And outcome number 1 would be that we have the surgery is successful, and my son lives healthily. So that would be option number 1. We have the choice to act with a good outcome. That's option 1. Option number 2 would be that we choose to act, we choose to approve the surgery, but there's some complication or the surgery is not successful, and the surgery actually becomes a source or a cause of suffering and possibly death for my son. So that's the second scenario. 2 scenarios based on the choice to act and have the surgery. And then I thought about the other 2 scenarios. The third scenario would be we choose not to act, but there's a good outcome. We choose not to have the surgery, but my son, as he grows and develops, heals naturally and goes on to live a healthy life. And the surgeon explained that that was a possibility, that since the child was so young and he had so much growing and development still to do, it was possible that the whole could heal itself and he could go on and live healthily. So the third option is to have no surgery, for the problem to heal naturally and for my son to live healthily. And then the fourth option was to choose to not have the surgery and have my son's condition worsen, leading to his possible death. So those were the four different scenarios that I faced. And then what I did was, as I thought about those four different scenarios, I realized that they weren't equal. Some of them were better and worse than others. In fact, there was a best option and there was a worst option. And as I looked through the different scenarios, I said to myself, I think if I chose to have the surgery and the surgery became a cause of my son's suffering and death, I think that would be the worst possible scenario. Because I was told there is a chance that this problem could heal, that the surgery wasn't necessarily necessary, but there could be healing naturally. If I chose to have the surgery and then the surgery turned out to be unsuccessful and became a cause of my son's suffering, if it exacerbated the conditions, I don't think I would ever be able to live with myself. That would haunt me for the rest of my life, making that decision. And so I marked that option to have the surgery and possibly have a negative outcome. I marked that as the worst of the four scenarios. Then I thought about the other three and I said, well, the best scenario would be to have no surgery, to not take upon us the risk of an unsuccessful surgery, to not have the surgery, and by God's grace, my son would heal naturally and go on to live healthily. That would be the best scenario, to have no surgery and have natural healing and health. So that option, I ranked that number one. That's the best option. And then I was left with two other options. The other option was to choose to have the surgery and the surgery go well, to take the risk of the surgery, but have the surgery be successful and my son goes on to live healthily. That, I thought, was a good option. Yet it was risky, a risky option, but with a good outcome. And then the final scenario was to choose to not have the surgery and to have my son's condition not heal and he go on to die from a natural defect or of natural causes that really weren't in my control. And as I thought about those two scenarios, what it came down to was, how great is the risk of the surgery? If the surgery risk was relatively small, then taking the risk to have that outcome of a successful surgery might be worth it. But the doctor made it clear that the risk of the surgery was very great. The greatness of the risk of the surgery put me at risk of causing the worst of the scenarios, which was the surgery becoming the cause of my son's suffering and death. And so because the risk was high, the option to have the surgery and have a good outcome was actually not probable. And so I couldn't say that going ahead with the surgery would likely produce the good outcome. And then thinking of the last option, if my son did go on to die of natural causes, I would know that the problem that he suffered from was natural, wasn't something that I had caused, wasn't anyone's fault, and that it occurred because the surgery was very risky and risked worse problems. And I could live with myself with a good conscience, knowing that we chose to not have the surgery. The healing that was possible did not happen, but that my son died of a natural birth defect. I could live at peace with that, and I thought it was worth taking the risk to allow my son to heal naturally and not take things into my own hands and subject him to the risk of a loss of life or further damage by a surgery. And so after weighing all of the options, I chose to not have the surgery and to pray and hope that God would allow my son's condition to heal and he would go on to live healthily. And thanks be to God, that's what happened. We chose to not have the surgery, and my son healed and is now a perfectly healthy, strong 22-year-old American soldier. So the fears of him getting worse or having complications have been completely eliminated. But that method of wrestling through the decision was very helpful and gave my wife and I a sense of peace that we were not taking upon ourselves a decision that put our son at risk unnecessarily, but that if there was any negative outcome, it would be caused by nature, by divine providence, and not by anything that we had chosen to do, no presumptuous action of our own. So that was that, and we went through that scenario in our lives, and it turned out well, thanks be to God. But what happened in the future is that when I came into difficult scenarios again, I realized that that method of going through those 4 different scenarios, that method became helpful in other questions, in other problems, with other decisions. And I had experience working through that, so when new problems came up, when new challenges came up, that same method was helpful to me to make decisions where there really seemed to be no way to make a confident decision. And so, again, to generalize this method, which may seem very simple, and I think it is very simple, but it's sometimes we just don't think of it like this. To generalize this method, basically, we've got to break the decision down to a point where it becomes a simple yes or no decision. It's a choice of 2 contraries. We're either going to do something or not do something. And then we've got to consider that there are 2 possible outcomes, a desirable outcome and an undesirable outcome. And we've got to think of how each option before us with respect to our action or decision relates to these 2 possible outcomes. If we choose to act and it leads to a good outcome, if we choose to act and it leads or contributes to an undesirable outcome, if we don't act and a good outcome results, or if we don't act and an undesirable outcome comes of it, which of those 4 scenarios makes for us the best decision? Now, you might think, well, why don't you choose the best scenario? Why don't you always choose the best scenario? Because many times the best scenario is really not in our control. Like, for example, the scenario where we don't have the surgery and my son heals, obviously the healing part is not in my control. That's the ideal, but it's not in my control. And again, is it presumptuous to think that God is going to heal my son? That's a controversial question itself. So we can't just choose the best option, but we can often choose to give God a chance to bring about the best option when the other option is not problematic. In my case, because my son's heart condition was a natural birth defect, if the healing didn't come and he would have died as a result of that defect, I would not think that I was the cause of his death or even of suffering, if there was any. And so it was worth the opportunity to give God a chance to heal him without being presumptuous or negligent in any way. So that's where we've got to think about the four different scenarios and ask not which is necessarily the best or which is the worst, but how can we avoid the worst scenario, or how can we give ourselves a chance at the best scenario and allow that based on the details of the risks and things of the specific situation, usually choosing between one of the two middle options as our best decision and the best of the worst scenarios, if we can think of it like that. So that's a way, I think, a general method that we can use to work through the details in sort of a detached, rational way without getting emotions involved, without allowing ideals to lead us to irresponsible decisions. I think by using that method where we consider the two options and the two possible outcomes and how they relate to those two options before us, I think we can come up with what would be a decision that we could live with. A decision where if it worked out for the worse, would not trouble our conscience in the future, but is a good conscientious decision. And that, I think, is a useful, actually, it has proven to be a useful method of decision making time and time again throughout my adult life. So that's the method that I wanted to share. And then just to make a few comments on this whole issue in our lives as Christians, because I think Christians are especially troubled by this for a number of reasons, because we fear God, to put it simply. We don't want to make a selfish decision or a negligent decision. We don't want to make a faithless decision. We fear God. We don't want to do something that is wrong or evil in God's presence. We fear God, and so we're concerned about these decisions more than other people might be. Other people might not be so concerned. They might be concerned if there's, money to be gained or lost, or if there's pain to be endured. But they don't consider whether or not our decisions please, honor, or dishonor God. Whereas Christians, we have that fear of God that in a healthy way kind of haunts us as we make decisions. We want to do what's right in God's sight. So we have that. Secondly, and positively, we're often eager to glorify God. We're told as Christians, as the church collectively, to go into the world and make disciples. We have this positive, active mission as Christians, and we often wonder, whether or not we should be pursuing greater things. We wonder whether we should move from what's good to something that's better, because we know that we have been called to an active, evangelistic, apostolic life, all in our own ways, according to our own unique circumstances and gifts and so on. And so we're always wondering, I think, whether we should be doing more, whether there's something more that we can do, and so on. And our faith and the virtues kind of stir up in us this question of whether we could do something more. So even when things are good, we're still wrestling with decisions about opportunities we have and things where we could do something better or bigger or be more influential and so on. So I think a lot of times religion, the spirit of religion, leads us into these difficult decisions more than other people. I look around my neighborhood and see my neighbors just content to sit in their house, cut their grass, watch television, have a barbecue, and meanwhile, I'm thinking about restoring Catholic education and researching this and changing that and going here and doing that. I look around and I sometimes wonder how my neighbors can live like that. Like they have the kinds of thoughts or desires or ambitions that I have? Don't they have the fears and worries that I have? It seems that they're content just to go about their life eating and drinking, making merry, watching television, following the news, going to and from their job where they get their paycheck, paying their mortgage, and so on. And I just don't feel like I can live like that. I feel like I have to do more, like I'm called and challenged to do more. So it's a weird dilemma. And I think as Christians, we struggle with these kinds of things. I know looking around at other Christians, I can see other Christians struggling with all kinds of things that our common non-Christian neighbors don't seem to struggle with. So I think we've got to have a way of making these decisions and making them well. And if I think about what St. Paul says in Romans chapter 12, he says, do not be conformed to the image of this world or the likeness of this world. Do not be like the world. So we're not supposed to be like our neighbors, but he says, rather, be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may know what is God's will. So we can see that this wrestling to know God's will in our lives and to not just be like the world, that really is part of the Christian life. And so I don't think that we're crazy for feeling the way we do. I think it's actually an effect of our spiritual life that drives us to want to know what God's will is for us in different scenarios, when we have different opportunities and so on. When we look back at the lives of the saints, we can say, well, and if you watch the life of John Bosco, you'll see that the other priests around him, his bishop, they're looking at him saying, why are you doing this? You don't need to do this. You're not responsible for all these boys. Teresa of Calcutta, you're not responsible for all of these poor, sick, suffering people in India. Why are you bringing all of this burden upon yourself? Why do you think that you need to take up this work of, taking care of the orphans in India? You're not responsible for these orphans. You're not responsible, John Bosco, for these street kids in Italy. Why don't you just relax? Just be a parish priest. That's already a good life. That is a good work. That's a life sufficient in itself. Or for Teresa, she was already a nun before she became Mother Teresa and founded her own religious order. She was already a nun, already doing good, teaching in schools and so on. Why couldn't she just be content with her simple vocation as a teacher? Why couldn't John Bosco just be content with his simple vocation as a priest? And the answer is, as both of them would explain, because God inspires us to greater things. We have faith and hope and charity, and we see ourselves as being able to help people and do good things, and we desire to do good things. We desire to be useful as instruments in God's hand, as Mother Teresa would say. We want to be useful. We want to be faithful instruments in God's hands, and that's what we want to do. And so we have this constant inspiration to want to do more and to ask whether we're doing all that we can. And St. Paul tells us to pray for greater spiritual gifts, not to be content with what we've had, but to seek more. He tells the Corinthians, I think it was, that even though they have been so charitable, to excel still more in their charity. And it's this desire to be all that we can be, not just to be content with what we happen to be. And we feel that. We feel that we can do more. We think about stories of the Bible, like when Jonathan chooses to attack Israel's enemies in the Old Testament. He chooses to run upon the camp by himself, and he says to his armor bearer, I think it was, he says, God is able to deliver by many or by few. And he's got this faith and this confidence that God can help him to fight against the enemy by himself. We've got the story of David and Goliath. We've got Moses leading the Hebrews out of captivity. We've got the apostles taking over Israel and thousands being converted. We've got all of these stories in the scriptures and in church history and the lives of the saints, and they inspire us to ask, why not me? Why not us? Why can't God use us to do these things? So I think as Christians, we're often, I wouldn't say tormented, but we're often challenged by this thought of whether we might be able to do more, and that leads us into difficult decisions to make. And again, I've had to make these decisions myself on many occasions throughout my Christian life. So that's one thing. We've got to realize that this thrusting ourselves often into situations where there are very difficult decisions to make is, I think, part of the Christian life, especially for those called to action as Catholics, to do something about the problems rather than to just observe them or comment on them, to actually try and solve the problems rather than complain about them. So I think that's part of a Christian life, a virtuous spirit. That's the first thing. In light of that, however, we've also got to temper those thoughts and desires with the realization that we're imperfect creatures. We don't have the knowledge. We don't understand what we should do. We often don't have the strength. Our strength comes and goes. We don't have the wisdom to understand, or the prudence to understand practically how to go about different things. We're limited in our humanity. And so you can see how that desire to do great things joined together with the limitations of our humanity can produce a real vexation in us that can torment us in these situations. So we can see why these decisions trouble us so much and why we get frustrated because it doesn't seem like we can find the answers that we need. We can't find all the information. And so just to have some general principles, first of all, one thing that I was advised when I was a college student, I had an old pastor who advised me one time as he watched me wrestle through different things that I was anxious about in the future and decisions that I would have to make. He told me that we never need to make a decision until the last moment. We never need to make a decision until the last moment. And so not to be anxious about decisions, not to be worried about making a decision when it's not yet time for that decision to be made. And in the time that remains, we have time to study, we have time to pray, we have time to allow providence to work itself out and to change different things. So we really don't know all the details of what we will know, what will happen, what the circumstances will be, and so on, until the last moment when a decision must be made. So I think one of the general principles to keep in mind when we're making decisions is that we can't make the best decision until the last minute. When we've collected as much information as we can, we see all of the actual circumstances in which the decision needs to be made, and we can actually make the most intelligent, well-informed decision that's possible given the time frame. So not to worry about things, not to stress about decisions in the future, because we never need to make a decision until the last minute when that decision must be made. So that's been a good piece of advice for me. I often find myself anxious and upset about decisions that don't even need to be made right now and really can't be made right now because there's still more information and the details of the actual circumstances that need to be known, and they won't be known until the very end. So that's been a good piece of advice that has helped me through the years. Secondly, I think we've got to ask ourselves morally, what is our duty? What is our duty? So when we've got a decision to make, I think it's very comforting to know that as a human being, I do not have all of the knowledge that's necessary for my life. As a human being, my ability to predict the future is very, very limited. I don't have all the information. I don't know what other people will do. There are a million different things that I can't control. I can't predict what's going to happen. I can't think of every different possible scenario that might arise. And so there's a sense in which I'm really not responsible for the outcomes of my decisions. And again, Mother Teresa of Calcutta had a saying. She said, "We're not asked to be successful, only to be faithful." And so ultimately the question is, obviously we have this desire to say, what should we do to succeed? What should we do to be successful? There's just a natural desire to make a decision that leads to success, but often we don't know what decision would lead to success. And we need to realize that our duty is simpler than that. Our duty is actually within our human control. And that duty is to simply make a decision that we know to be in harmony with God's will. That's much easier. It's much easier for us to make a decision that we know is in harmony with God's will than to try to predict what the outcomes will be and make a decision based on what option will lead to success, because that's not in our control. So you can see sometimes trying to guess the future for the sake of being successful may just be impossible for us, because we don't know enough as humans to be able to do that. We'd be like soothsayers if we could do that. We'd be fortune tellers if we could guess the future correctly all the time. That's really not what we're asked to do. We're asked to just be faithful and to make a decision in God's presence, a prayerful decision, open before the Lord, where we seek to make a decision that we are confident does not offend God, does not violate his commandments, isn't contrary to church teaching, doesn't trouble our conscience, and so on, just to make a faithful decision in the circumstances. Because if we make a faithful decision and that decision turns out to lead to an unsuccessful end, we can face that unsuccessful end as a new problem to deal with in the Christian life. And we can look back and say, I have to face this problem because I made a faithful decision in the past, a faithful decision that led to this unfortunate outcome. I'm proud of the decision that I made because I know that when I made it in light of all the information that I had available to me. I made it in light of whatever help I could find to make the decision, and I made a decision that I knew, as far as was possible with me, I knew was not contrary to God's will. And so I'm proud of that decision. The outcome is not what I had hoped for, but then again, I don't know what the best outcome would be for me. Only God knows. And this outcome, which I judge to be a bad outcome or an undesirable outcome, may in fact be the best outcome for me. So I don't know. I don't know what I should pray for. There's a good example in St. Monica where St. Monica was crying and pleading with St. Ambrose concerning St. Augustine, and it ended up that St. Monica had seen that her prayers were never answered. God never answered her prayer. Augustine never converted, and she was frustrated and confused and upset that it seemed that God wouldn't give her what she wanted. And then the outcome, of course, is wonderful. Her son not only converts to the Christian faith, he becomes one of the greatest Christians to ever live. And so we see in the example of St. Monica where God gives a person what they need but not what they actually ask for or want. God gives them, God knows what the intention of Monica's prayers were, and he gave her more than she could ever imagine. And she was frustrated because it didn't seem that the outcomes were what they should be based on her own judgment. And her judgment was, in fact, the problem. Remember, that's why it's difficult to make a decision in the first place. And facing trials, facing difficulties, facing disappointments and misfortunes and so on, that's not a problem for Christians. Trials that we face, difficulties we face, misfortunes, disappointments, we're told to count them all as joys by St. James. Because with God's grace, we can continue to persevere and take on every new challenge and face every new problem and just continue to work with a good conscience to move forward in life, obedient to God's will as far as we're able to understand it in our circumstances. And so even if a decision does lead to an undesirable outcome, we need to remind ourselves that we really don't know what the best outcome would be. And with God's help, we're able to face this new set of circumstances and deal with these new problems and carry on in the Christian life. So we're to make the best decision that we can. We're to gather the information we can, ask for counsel from anyone who might be helpful, look at all the possible scenarios, and I've provided a general method that I think is helpful for doing this. And then when we've come to the end of our rope, we can simply entrust the decision to God, make the best decision that we can as imperfect human beings who lack knowledge, who lack any knowledge of the future, obviously. Just make the most faithful decision that we can make. And really, either decision may be perfectly acceptable. We may have two options where option A is good and option B is possibly better. Both options are morally sound. And so we may not really even have that great of a dilemma. But we can simply make the decision that seems the best to us, is most pleasing to us, seems to be in harmony with God's will, and based on what we know and what we can use to make the decision, is the best decision for us. And then look back at that decision without any guilt, without any regrets or doubts, and just move forward in life and really not worry about it. Like Padre Pio says, pray, hope, and don't worry. Take that approach to it. There's one last thing I'd like to talk about before I close, something that I've thought about recently regarding regrets. When we look back at our lives and we have regrets, we say, I wish that when we had that opportunity, we would have done this, or I wish I would have decided to do this instead of that. I was so stupid. I regret that decision. I wish I could go back and do that over again. As I've thought through this question of regrets, I've realized recently that it's an irrational thought. Regrets are irrational. They're not reasonable. And here's why. When we look back to decisions we've made, as long as we weren't sinning or doing something foolish, we've made decisions in our lives to the best of our ability. We've done the best that we could. We gathered information, we tried to make a good decision, and we likely have prayed for wisdom and help making the decision, and then we finally just cast our vote and made the decision and moved forward. And at the time, there was nothing else that we could have done. There was nothing else that we could have done, and there were reasons why we didn't choose the other options. But then we go on after the decision and things don't turn out as we hoped, and we regret the decision. Now here's the fallacy in this, I believe, the fallacy in regrets. When we look back at a decision and regret it, we assume that the other option would have worked out well. We assume that the other option would have worked out well, and we don't necessarily know that. Just because the choice that we made didn't work out as we hoped, if we had made the other choice, we can't be certain that the desirable outcome would have been enjoyed. It seems that the other decision would have brought us a more desirable outcome, but that is not certain. It may be probable, but it's not certain. And so I think we often torment ourselves with regret that's irrational because we assume, without justification, we assume that, oh man, had I made the other choice, everything would have turned out well. And we don't know if that's true. So really looking back at the past, we shouldn't look back and regret decisions we've made. We shouldn't look back and second guess ourselves because it's likely that we made the best decision that we could at that time in those circumstances with the knowledge we had at that time. And it's not fair to criticize ourselves in the future with knowledge and experience that we didn't have at the time we made that decision. So I think we have to learn to not look back, but just to keep looking forward and to focus on the next decision and make the best possible decision we can. Not to worry about what's behind us, but to move forward and constantly try to do the best we can. Because ultimately, we're going to be judged relative to what we have, not to what we don't have. Jesus says, to whom much is given, much is expected. To whom less is given, less is expected. If I don't have all of the resources I need to make successful decisions, I'm not going to be condemned for my decisions. So I don't need to live with any fear of guilt. And ultimately, my goal in life, like Mother Teresa said, is not to be successful, but to be faithful. Success is not in my control. Faithfulness is in my control. My desire is to be faithful, not to torment myself with pressure to be successful, but to ask myself, what decision is a faithful decision? What decision can I be certain is not contrary to God's will? And again, I could have two decisions, two options that I think are both possibly God's will. And in that situation, I can't make a mistake because my goal is simply to be faithful, not to try to predict the future and be successful because I just can't do that. It's not in my control. So having said all that, I think that may be helpful. I hope to be helpful. Based on my experience, I'm just about 50 years old. I know if I'm talking to a 60-year-old or 70-year-old, they might think that what I'm saying is immature and stupid. But for younger people, hey, if you can find a 100-year-old wise man to consult, that's what you should do. But if you're a younger person who lacks even the experience that I have or lacks the knowledge that I've been able to come up with, this might be helpful. And that's all that I hope it to be. I would like it to be helpful in a way that I would have appreciated when I was 25 years old or when I was 35 years old. If somebody who is older with some experience that I didn't have yet could come to me and say, hey, let me share my experience with you. Maybe it'll help you to avoid something negative that I experienced, or maybe you could make a decision that would be better than the one I made. I think that's just an act of charity to our neighbor, being able to try to help them have better success than we did. But at the same time, reminding them of these principles, helping them to not be anxious, and teaching them to concentrate on being faithful and not to worry too much about being successful. So that's my intention with this talk. Again, the method is to break a decision down into two possible actions with two possible outcomes, which leaves us with 4 scenarios to think through and to try to figure out which of those 4 scenarios we can live with conscientiously, which we couldn't live with, because it's likely a question not of what should we do, but what should we not do? What option would we not be able to live with because we would be troubled by it in conscience in the future? So I think that's the question. Maybe not so much what should we do, which is very difficult, but what should we not do? Just like taking a quiz with multiple choice questions where you don't know the answer. And what you're taught in those situations is, well, use the process of elimination. Which is the worst answer? Which is obviously not the right answer? Cross that off. What are you left with? You're left with two choices? Okay. Now pick which one seems best and move on. So I hope that that's helpful. If there's anything you'd like to talk about with respect to more specific individual circumstances or decisions, I'm happy to help if you think I can help. Just get in touch with me by email. But as for today, I hope that developing something of a method for decision making and thinking of some general principles when making decisions as Christians can prove to be helpful. God bless.